This set of slides, I think, is a component of the overall TSCA that probably is something that most facilities, organization should keep track of and would not want to be a subject of if there's something that is not in compliance. And these touch upon the requirements for record keeping, accurate record keeping, adequate record keeping, and then the APA audits. So per the rule, there's specific requirements for preservation and archiving of really essentially all and any TSCA records as it pertains to this law. Typically, you need to keep the records for 5 years. Make sure that that requirements is really coinciding with your company's retention policy, that you do not inadvertently use records. And then once you are audited, definitely the auditor will look for this record, the supporting documentation, and from current and prior submissions. So make sure that the backup is also there. So I think in general, it's better to keep more records than fewer records. And I know organizations these days would want to minimize the number of records kept for various reasons, but it's never a bad idea to have a little bit of extra in case you are audited, just to give yourself a little bit of a way out. The typical pitfalls we see out there is that there's some underreporting is happening, and that's for various reasons. So when you do think about your next CDR, for example, make sure that you have talked and covered all the departments who may have the relevant information. There's also frequently chemical nomenclature issues, and this is particular with those UVCBs, complex substances, which sometimes are confusing, and they may not fall under the right category. But these are the nuances that you really need to seek an expert to help you with, as well as your process engineers. And finally, there's also inadequate, insufficient, or faulty, simply faulty record keeping. The inspectors are simply unable to find the records that he or she may be looking for, or you have claimed that you have in your previous submittal. Now we come to the enforcement. So in a scenario that the EPA auditor may find that something's not quite right, a violation would be applicable. The TSCA law has significant strength in terms of implementation and enforcement. So there's civil penalties, and there's also criminal enforcement for the worst offenders. The penalties typically are monetary penalties, but they run into thousands of dollars per violation per day. So if you have multiple issues over multiple days, they can add up pretty quickly, and that can ultimately affect the bottom line of the project department or the business unit. So certainly something that you might want to avoid. And there's also ability to imprison the responsible party official, company official, if there's overt non-compliance. Something I mentioned very early in this webinar, there was a very significant bipartisan support of the reform TSCA. This program is very well funded. I think everyone is interested in making sure that it's fully implemented. And as such, there's rather vigorous inspections and enforcement going on. And there have been many cases of cumulative fines totaling into millions of dollars. And then this is one of the last slides here before I switch to some of the resources that you may need in your line of work in TSCA. Is just a quick look at the 2020 and beyond. One outstanding item is that when will the final CDR rule amendment be published in the Federal Register? Well, it still hasn't, so be coming out anytime. It's late February now, potentially March, and certainly it would be good to have that rule out by June 1st, which is the opening of the CDR season, so to speak. There's also, not too long ago, the Confidential Business Information Rule was issued in February 19 of this year. And then the scoping documentation for the next 20 chemicals, the high priority chemicals, are about to be published, and that's on March 22nd. Something that's highlighted on my slide is the fees self-reporting deadline. I talked about it in the other slide, is that if you are somehow linked as a manufacturer, imported, even if part of an article, which typically is excluded from TSCA, for one of the 20 high priority substances, you have the requirement to self-report by March 27 of this year. And then you might be assessed certain portion of the overall cost of performing risk evaluations. Now, if you fail to self-report, there might be consequences, as I mentioned before, civil penalty most likely, unlikely criminal, but that's what could happen to organization. Then we talked about the June 1st commencement of the CDR reporting. And then later that a month, there will be the final risk evaluations issued for the very first 10 chemicals in that risk evaluation pipeline, and so on. So at the end of this year and then going forward, there's some dates that are mentioned in the slide, but ultimately, essentially from now on, there is that repeated loop, a continuous loop of risk prioritization, risk evaluation, and then risk management on the active current TSCA inventory.